A millionaire pays a woman to carry his heir, but her story changes his life forever. The gentle hum of the city filtered through Maria Alvarez's apartment window. The sound was both a comfort and a reminder of her struggles, of the reality that life in this city never stopped moving, never paused to wait for her to catch up. She cradled her daughter, Sophia, who was no more than 6 months old, against her chest, swaying gently as she hummed a lullaby. Sophia's tiny fists curled in her sleep, the faint rise and fall of her chest grounding Maria in this fleeting moment of peace. But peace was a luxury Maria couldn't afford. Not when the overdue bills sat like a taunt on the worn kitchen counter. Not when Sophia's hospital appointments loomed over her like dark clouds, each one a reminder of the delicate balance Maria struggled to maintain. Sophia's condition wasn't life-threatening, at least not yet, but it required consistent care, medication, and specialized formula that Maria could barely afford on her waitress salary. Her phone buzzed on the counter, snapping her out of her thoughts. Adjusting Sophia on her shoulder, she reached for it. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway. "Ms. Alvarez?" The voice on the other end was smooth, practiced, and unyieldingly professional. "Yes, this is Maria," she replied, a hint of caution lacing her tone. "My name is Richard Carter. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Victor Langston. He would like to meet with you regarding a business proposition." Maria frowned, shifting the phone to her other hand. "I think you've got the wrong person. I don't know a Victor Langston. Actually, we believe you might be the perfect candidate for an opportunity Mr. Langston is offering," Richard continued, his voice calm and measured. "It's an opportunity that could be quite lucrative." Maria hesitated. The word lucrative hung in the air like a beacon, but her instincts screamed caution. "What kind of opportunity?" "Mr. Langston prefers to explain these matters in person," Richard replied. "Would you be available tomorrow at 10 a.m.? Transportation will be arranged for you." "But I have work," Maria stammered, the weight of her responsibilities anchoring her. "I can't just—" "It would be worth your time," Richard interrupted, a slight edge creeping into his tone. "Mr. Langston is a generous man, and he is willing to compensate you for the inconvenience." Maria's mind raced. Compensation? Money? She looked down at Sophia, her little face nestled against Maria's shoulder, blissfully unaware of the world's harsh realities. "All right," Maria said finally. "I'll come." The following morning, a sleek black car idled outside Maria's apartment building. She hesitated on the curb, Sophia in her arms, before a sharply dressed chauffeur stepped out to open the door for her. "Ms. Alvarez?" he asked, his tone polite but distant. Maria nodded and climbed into the car. The leather seats were cold against her legs, and Sophia stirred but didn't wake. As the city blurred past the tinted windows, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was heading into something far beyond her comprehension. The car pulled into the circular driveway of a sprawling mansion, its grandeur so far removed from Maria's world that it felt almost surreal. The chauffeur opened her door, and Maria stepped out, clutching Sophia tightly as if her daughter's presence alone could anchor her. Richard Carter, a tall man with silver hair and a perfectly tailored suit, greeted her at the entrance. His smile was polite but devoid of warmth. "Ms. Alvarez, welcome. Please, follow me," he said, gesturing for her to enter. The interior of the mansion was as intimidating as its exterior, marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and an air of sterile perfection. Richard led Maria to a sitting room where Victor Langston waited, standing by a large window that overlooked an immaculately manicured garden. Victor turned as they entered, his presence commanding. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His tailored suit spoke of wealth, but his eyes, calculating and unreadable, betrayed little emotion. "Ms. Alvarez," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." Maria shifted Sophia to her other arm before shaking his hand, her grip firm despite the unease bubbling beneath the surface. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice steady. "Please, have a seat," Victor said, gesturing to a plush chair. Maria hesitated but complied, adjusting Sophia on her lap. Victor took the seat opposite her, his gaze unwavering. "I'll get straight to the point. I've done my research on you, Ms. Alvarez. You're a single mother, hardworking and resilient. Traits I admire. Maria stiffened. What exactly is this about, Mr. Langston? Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I need an heir. Someone to carry my child. The words hung in the air, heavy and disorienting. Maria blinked, certain she had misheard. I'm sorry, what? Victor's expression remained unchanged. I want you to be a surrogate for my child. I'm prepared to offer you $1 million in exchange. Maria's breath caught in her throat. $1 million. The number echoed in her mind, both intoxicating and overwhelming. But as quickly as the possibility took hold, doubt crept in. Why me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Because you've proven yourself capable of raising a child under difficult circumstances. That, and my team has thoroughly vetted you. You're the perfect candidate. Maria's mind raced. The money could change everything. Sophia's medical care, their living situation, a future she couldn't even dare to dream of. But the offer felt transactional, cold, and detached from the reality of what he was asking. This isn't something I can decide overnight, she said finally, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay composed. Of course, Victor replied smoothly. Take your time. But understand this, opportunities like this don't come often. Maria stood abruptly, clutching Sophia protectively. I need to think about it, she said, her tone firmer now. Victor rose as well, towering over her. I hope you'll make the right decision, Ms. Alvarez. As Maria walked back to the waiting car, her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She looked down at Sophia, who was now awake and watching her with wide, curious eyes. What do I do, Sophia? Maria whispered, her voice breaking. What do I do? The night after her meeting with Victor, Maria couldn't sleep. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the crumpled paper of her overdue bills. The dim glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the room, mirroring the ones in her mind. $1 million. The words kept circling her thoughts, louder than the creak of the floorboards and the hum of the refrigerator. It was more money than she could dream of earning in a lifetime as a waitress. It meant Sophia's future was secured, a life without worrying about medical bills or eviction notices. But the price felt heavy, intangible in a way that money couldn't balance. Sophia stirred in her crib, her small whimper piercing through Maria's haze of thought. She moved instinctively, lifting her daughter and cradling her close. Sophia's tiny hand curled around Maria's finger, grounding her for a moment in the present. Mommy's here, Maria murmured, kissing her daughter's forehead. Always. She sat on the edge of her bed, rocking Sophia gently as her mind wandered back to Victor Langston. There had been something unsettling about him, not in a dangerous way, but in his utter lack of warmth. He'd spoken of creating a life with the same tone someone might use to discuss a business merger. It didn't feel right. And yet, the prospect of financial security was impossible to ignore. By the next morning, Maria found herself dialing Richard Carter's number. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pressed the call button. Ms. Alvarez, Richard's voice came through as polished as ever. Have you made a decision? I need to speak to Mr. Langston again, Maria said, trying to steady her voice. There are things I need to clarify before I agree to anything. Understood, Richard replied. I'll arrange for transportation. Later that afternoon, Maria found herself back in Victor's imposing mansion. This time, she was alone. Sophia was with a neighbor who had agreed to babysit for the afternoon. Victor greeted her in the same sitting room, his expression as neutral and unreadable as before. I didn't expect to see you again so soon, Victor said, gesturing for her to sit. Maria hesitated but took the seat. I have questions, she said firmly, meeting his gaze. Of course, Victor replied, leaning back slightly. Ask away. Maria took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. Why do you want a child, Mr. Langston? You don't seem like the kind of man who... She paused, realizing how harsh her words sounded. Victor raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The kind of man who wants to create a family? Maria nodded cautiously. You're not wrong, Victor admitted. I'm not driven by sentimentality. My reasons are practical. An heir is a necessity for someone in my position. Legacy is everything. Maria frowned. Legacy? That's all this is about? Passing down your wealth and name? Victor's smile faded, and for the first time, a flicker of something, perhaps vulnerability, crossed his face. I grew up under the shadow of a man who valued nothing but legacy. My father built an empire and demanded perfection at every turn. It was never about love or connection. It was about power, control. That's the world I've inherited, Ms. Alvarez. Whether I like it or not. Maria was quiet for a moment, absorbing his words. And you think a child will fix that? Victor's gaze hardened slightly. I don't expect you to understand my world. But this isn't about fixing anything. It's about securing what I've built. The coldness of his tone was like a slap, and Maria's resolve faltered. A child is more than a tool, Mr. Langston, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. They're a person, a soul. Not something you can mold to fit your agenda. Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the sprawling garden beyond. Perhaps you're right, he said quietly. But this is the only way I know how to move forward. Maria rose from her seat, her chest tight with emotion. If I agree to this, she said, her voice steady, I need assurances. I won't be treated like some disposable object in your plan. And I won't let you treat this child that way either. Victor turned to face her, his expression unreadable once more. You're in no position to make demands, Ms. Alvarez. I'm in every position, Maria shot back, surprising even herself with her defiance. You need me, Mr. Langston. Not the other way around. For a moment, Victor seemed taken aback. Then, to Maria's surprise, he let out a soft laugh. You're braver than most people I know, he said. I'll give you that. Maria didn't flinch under his gaze. I need time to think, she said firmly. And I need to know that if I do this, you'll treat me, and the child, with respect. Victor nodded slowly. Fair enough. Take the time you need. Over the next few days, Maria wrestled with her decision. She found herself replaying her conversations with Victor, dissecting every word, every nuance. There was something about him that unsettled her, but there was also a depth she hadn't expected, a complexity that hinted at something more than the cold exterior he presented. She spent hours holding Sophia, whispering to her about the possibilities of a better life. Imagine it, Sophia, she murmured one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon. A home where we don't have to worry. Doctors who can help you. A chance for something more. But the idea of bringing another child into the world under such cold, transactional terms weighed heavily on her heart. Could she live with herself knowing she'd agreed to something so impersonal? Finally, Maria made her decision. She called Richard once more, her voice steady but resolute. Tell Mr. Langston I'll do it, she said. But I have conditions. When she returned to the mansion the next day, Victor greeted her with a faint smile. I see you've come to a decision, he said. Maria nodded. I'll be your surrogate. But I have a few rules. Victor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Rules? Yes, Maria said firmly. First, I stay in my home. I won't be confined to some sterile environment you think is suitable for your legacy. My life will remain mine. Victor considered this for a moment before nodding. Agreed. Second, Maria continued, you'll have no right to dictate how I carry this child beyond what's medically necessary. And third, she hesitated, meeting his gaze. You'll need to be involved. Not just as someone paying for this, but as a father. If you want this child, you'll need to be there for them. Victor's expression darkened slightly. You're asking a lot, Ms. Alvarez. I'm asking for what's fair, Maria countered. If you can't agree to that, then find someone else. Victor stared at her for a long moment, the room heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, he nodded. You have my word. Maria exhaled slowly, relief and apprehension swirling within her. Then we have a deal. The days that followed their agreement were strange for Maria. Life at home remained much the same. Early mornings filled with Sophia's giggles, balancing shifts at the diner, and nights spent with her daughter nestled against her chest. But a sense of unease lingered, a feeling that she was stepping into a world she didn't belong to. Victor's influence started to seep into her life in subtle ways. The day after their agreement, a black car arrived outside her apartment, delivering documents for her to sign, contracts outlining the terms of the surrogacy. Maria spent hours poring over them, her brow furrowed as she read the dense legal jargon. She hated the way the papers framed her decision. Clinical words like carrier and custodian reduced her to little more than a vessel. She scribbled her signature where necessary but couldn't shake the feeling that she was signing away something far more profound than the agreement let on. That evening, Victor called her directly for the first time. His voice was calm and measured, though there was an edge to it that suggested he wasn't used to casual conversation. "Maria, I wanted to ensure you're comfortable with the arrangements," he began, his tone almost too formal. Maria glanced at Sophia, who was playing on the floor with her stuffed rabbit. "Comfortable isn't the word I'd use," she replied honestly. Victor paused, as though he hadn't expected her to be so blunt. "If there's anything you need, you only have to ask." Maria hesitated, the temptation to list every financial and emotional struggle on the tip of her tongue. But she knew better than to lay her vulnerabilities bare to a man like Victor. Instead, she said, "I'll let you know." There was a long silence on the line before Victor spoke again. "I meant what I said about respecting your terms. I want this to work for both of us." Maria sighed softly, leaning back against the couch. "We'll see," she murmured. "Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Langston." The first ultrasound was scheduled 2 weeks later. Maria was nervous, more for the unfamiliarity of having Victor involved than for the actual appointment. She'd asked him if it was really necessary for him to attend, but he'd insisted. "If I'm going to be involved, as you suggested, then I'll be there," he'd said. Victor's punctuality was as precise as everything else about him. He arrived at the clinic 10 minutes early, his tailored suit looking out of place against the peeling paint and outdated posters in the waiting room. Maria arrived shortly after, Sophia in tow. Victor's gaze softened slightly when he saw Sophia clutching her stuffed rabbit. "You brought her," he observed. "She goes where I go," Maria replied simply, shifting Sophia on her hip. Victor nodded but said nothing further. They sat side by side in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. Sophia, oblivious to the weight of the moment, babbled happily, offering Victor her rabbit with an outstretched hand. Victor hesitated before reaching for the toy, his movements almost awkward. He held the rabbit delicately, as though unsure what to do with it. Sophia giggled, a sound so pure it seemed to cut through the stiffness of the room. "She likes you," Maria said softly, surprised by the observation. Victor glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "She's a charming child." The ultrasound itself was an experience unlike any Maria had anticipated. The technician was kind but businesslike, guiding Maria through the process as Victor stood to the side, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on the monitor. When the rhythmic sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the room, Maria felt an unexpected lump in her throat. Victor's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted slightly, a subtle sign of the moment's impact. For a brief second, Maria thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that wasn't cold calculation. "It's strong," the technician said, smiling at Maria. "Everything looks perfect?" Maria nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and emotion. She glanced at Victor, half expecting him to remain silent, but to her surprise, he spoke. "Thank you," he said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the monitor. As the weeks turned into months, the arrangement began to take on a rhythm. Victor was true to his word, respecting Maria's boundaries and providing financial support without overstepping. Yet their interactions remained formal, almost transactional, as though neither could fully bridge the gap between their worlds. Victor's involvement with Sophia became an unexpected wrinkle in their arrangement. Whenever he visited to check in on Maria, Sophia seemed drawn to him, her innocent curiosity breaking through his reserved demeanor. Maria watched with a mixture of amusement and unease as Victor gradually warmed to the child's relentless affection. One evening, Victor arrived at Maria's apartment with a small, wrapped package in hand. Sophia toddled toward him, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the shiny paper. "What's this?" Maria asked, crossing her arms as she watched Victor kneel to Sophia's level. "A gift," Victor replied simply, handing the package to Sophia, who tore into it with unrestrained glee. Inside was a stuffed bear, soft and well-made, its little bow tie a testament to Victor's impeccable taste. "You didn't have to do that," Maria said, her voice tinged with both gratitude and suspicion. "I wanted to," Victor replied, rising to his feet. "She's a remarkable child." Maria couldn't help but smile as Sophia hugged the bear tightly, her laughter filling the room. For a moment, the tension between her and Victor seemed to ease, replaced by something that felt almost normal. As Maria's pregnancy progressed, she began to notice subtle changes in Victor. His visits grew more frequent, and while he still carried himself with the same stoic composure, there were cracks in his armor. He asked questions about Sophia, about Maria's life, about things that seemed to have no bearing on the arrangement itself. "Why didn't you ever go back to school?" Victor asked one evening, catching Maria off guard as they sat at the kitchen table. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug. "Life didn't exactly make room for that," she admitted. "After Sophia, everything became about surviving. Dreams don't pay the bills." Victor nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You had dreams, though." Maria smiled faintly, the memory bittersweet. "I wanted to be a teacher. Help kids who didn't have someone looking out for them. Funny how life works, huh?" Victor didn't reply immediately, but the intensity of his gaze unsettled her. "You still could," he said finally. "If you wanted to." Maria laughed softly, shaking her head. "It's a little late for that." "It's never too late," Victor said, his tone firm. "You've already proven you're capable of more than most people." Maria stared at him, unsure how to respond. There was something genuine in his words, something that hinted at a deeper understanding of her struggles. It was a side of Victor she hadn't expected to see, and it left her both intrigued and wary. The weeks leading up to Maria's third trimester brought new challenges. The physical toll of the pregnancy began to weigh on her, and Sophia's boundless energy made it difficult to rest. Victor noticed the strain and, without consulting Maria, hired a part-time nanny to help with Sophia. At first, Maria was furious. "You can't just make decisions for me, Victor," she snapped when he told her. "I was trying to help," Victor replied, his tone defensive. "You're clearly overwhelmed." "That's not the point," Maria said, her voice rising. "I didn't ask for your help." Victor took a step back, his expression softening. "You're right. I overstepped. I'll cancel the arrangement if that's what you want." Maria hesitated, caught off guard by his willingness to admit fault. "No," she said finally. "Just talk to me before you do something like that again." Victor nodded, the tension between them easing. "Understood." Maria sat at the edge of her bed, one hand resting on her swollen belly as the faint sounds of Sophia's laughter echoed from the living room. The nanny Victor had hired, a kind woman named Elena, had proven to be a lifesaver in recent weeks. Though Maria had been hesitant at first, she couldn't deny the relief of having someone help with Sophia while she navigated the physical and emotional challenges of her pregnancy. Still, the arrangement felt strange. Accepting help from Victor, a man who had once seemed so cold and distant, was a constant reminder of how entangled their lives had become. He had started showing up more frequently, checking in on her and Sophia with an almost alarming regularity. Though his presence had softened, his motives remained a mystery. One rainy afternoon, Victor arrived unannounced, carrying a box of Sophia's favorite cookies and a book Maria had once mentioned in passing. She looked up from the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, and raised an eyebrow. "You're getting good at this," Maria said, nodding toward the items in his hands. Victor smirked faintly, setting the cookies on the counter. "Good at what?" "Pretending to be human," she teased, though there was no malice in her tone. Victor chuckled softly, an unexpected sound that momentarily disarmed her. "I'll take that as a compliment." Maria dried her hands on a towel, leaning against the counter as she studied him. He looked different today, less guarded, almost approachable. She wondered if he noticed the subtle changes in himself, or if they were as much of a surprise to him as they were to her. "Why are you really here, Victor?" Maria asked, crossing her arms. You've been showing up a lot lately. Victor hesitated, his eyes flicking towards Sophia, who was sitting on the floor with Elena, absorbed in a game of stacking blocks. Can I simply check on you? He asked, his tone light. Maria's gaze narrowed. That's not your style. Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine, he said, his voice softening. I suppose I'm trying to understand this. Of it. You, Sophia, the baby. I didn't expect it to feel so real. Maria's defenses faltered at his admission. She had spent so much time seeing Victor as a detached businessman, someone incapable of genuine emotion, that hearing him speak with vulnerability caught her off guard. Real? She echoed, her voice quieter now. What did you think it would be? Victor shrugged, his gaze distant. I thought it would be simple. A transaction. But it's not. Maria stared at him, unsure how to respond. The man standing in front of her was a far cry from the one who had first offered her $1 million in exchange for carrying his heir. He was still guarded, still calculating in some ways, but there was a crack in his facade. A crack that made him human. Their conversation was interrupted by Sophia toddling over to Victor, her arms outstretched. Up, she demanded, her wide eyes and toothy grin impossible to resist. Victor hesitated, glancing at Maria as though seeking permission. She nodded, and he carefully lifted Sophia into his arms. The little girl giggled, patting his face with her tiny hands. Maria watched the scene with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Careful, she said. She might actually like you. Victor smirked, adjusting Sophia on his hip. What can I say? I'm charming. Maria rolled her eyes, but a smile tugged at her lips. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of what Victor might be like as a father, a possibility that both intrigued and terrified her. As the weeks passed, Maria began to notice more changes in Victor. He started asking questions about her life, about her hopes and fears, about the struggles she faced as a single mother. At first, she was hesitant to share, wary of letting him see too much of her vulnerability. But his curiosity seemed genuine, and little by little, she let her guard down. One evening, as they sat on the couch after Sophia had gone to bed, Maria found herself opening up about her past. She told Victor about the abusive relationship she had escaped, about the fear and uncertainty that had defined her life for so long. I thought I'd never get out, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But then I found out I was pregnant with Sophia, and something in me just changed. I couldn't let her grow up in that world. I had to find a way to survive. Victor listened intently, his expression unreadable but his eyes filled with something Maria couldn't quite place. When she finished, he nodded slowly, as though processing her words. You're stronger than you realize, he said finally, his voice soft. Most people would have given up. Maria shrugged, though his words stirred something in her. I didn't have a choice, she said. Sophia needed me. Victor was quiet for a moment before speaking again. I envy that, he admitted. Having something, or someone, to fight for. I've spent my whole life chasing things that don't matter. Maria frowned, her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Victor leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. My father was obsessed with legacy, with building something that would outlive him. He passed that obsession on to me, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why it mattered. I've spent years trying to prove myself, to live up to his expectations, but it's never felt meaningful. Maria watched him, her heart aching at the raw honesty in his voice. For the first time, she saw the man beneath the billionaire, the man who had spent his life carrying a weight that wasn't his to bear. You're allowed to want more than that, she said softly. You don't have to live your life by someone else's rules. Victor glanced at her, a flicker of something like hope crossing his face. Maybe, he said, but it's not easy to break free from the expectations you've been raised with. Maria nodded, understanding all too well the struggle of breaking free from a life that tried to define you. It's not easy, she agreed. But it's worth it. As Maria's due date approached, the dynamic between her and Victor continued to shift. What had once been a cold, transactional relationship had transformed into something far more complicated. They weren't exactly friends, but there was an unspoken understanding between them, a bond forged by shared vulnerability and the life they were about to bring into the world. Victor began spending more time at Maria's apartment, often staying for dinner and helping with Sophia's bedtime routine. Maria watched with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude as he read bedtime stories and sang lullabies in his slightly off-key voice. Sophia adored him, and though Maria tried to keep her guard up, she couldn't deny the warmth that filled her heart when she saw them together. One evening, as they sat on the couch after putting Sophia to bed, Victor turned to Maria with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Maria," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I want to be more than just the man who pays the bills. I want to be a part of this, of your life, Sophia's life, and the baby's life." Maria's heart raced, her mind struggling to process his words. She had spent so long seeing Victor as someone detached and unfeeling that the idea of him wanting to truly be involved felt almost surreal. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "This isn't just a game to you?" Victor shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't a game, Maria. This is the first thing in my life that feels real." Tears pricked at Maria's eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let herself get swept up in the moment. "It's not going to be easy," she warned. "You don't just get to step in and pretend like everything's perfect." "I don't expect it to be perfect," Victor said. "I just want a chance." Maria studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was a man who was trying, who was willing to confront his flaws and fight for something more. "All right," she said finally, her voice soft. "We'll try." Victor nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking across his face. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Maria woke up in the middle of the night, the baby's kicks sharp and insistent. She sat up in bed, wincing as she adjusted her position. It was becoming harder to sleep as her pregnancy progressed. She glanced over at the baby monitor on her nightstand, hearing Sophia's soft snores through the speaker. The quiet of the apartment felt heavier than usual, an unwelcome reminder of the uncertainties that lay ahead. Victor had called earlier that evening, checking in as he often did now. His voice had carried an unusual warmth, a far cry from the man who had once treated her as little more than a means to an end. She thought about the changes she'd seen in him over the past few months. He was still a man of immense control, but there was something softer about him now, something that made her believe he truly wanted to be part of this life they were building, however complicated it might be. But even as Victor tried to bridge the gap between their worlds, Maria couldn't shake the lingering fear that his commitment would falter when things became too real. She had seen too many people walk away when the burden became too great. Could Victor be any different? The next morning, Maria shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing her back as she poured herself a cup of coffee, decaf, much to her chagrin. Elena had already arrived, cheerfully preparing Sophia's breakfast while Sophia sat in her high chair, babbling excitedly. "You're glowing today," Elena said with a knowing smile, sliding a plate of toast toward Maria. Maria rolled her eyes, though she couldn't help but smile. "Glowing or just tired?" "Both," Elena teased. "Victor called while you were still asleep. Said he'd stop by later." Maria's heart skipped a beat, though she quickly masked her reaction. "Of course he did," she muttered, taking a bite of toast. "You know," Elena began, her tone careful, "he's changed a lot since I started working here. I've seen it in the way he looks at you and Sophia." "Like he's waking up?" Maria raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Victor doesn't strike me as the sentimental type." "Maybe not," Elena said, "but people can surprise you." Maria wanted to believe that was true, but the cynic in her refused to let her guard down completely. Victor arrived that afternoon as promised, carrying a bouquet of flowers that made Maria laugh out loud. "Flowers?" she said, raising an eyebrow as she opened the door. "What is this, a date?" Victor smirked, though a hint of embarrassment flickered across his face. "They're for Sophia," he said, handing them to her. "I thought she might like them." Maria stepped aside to let him in, shaking her head in amusement. "She'll probably try to eat them." "I'll take my chances," Victor replied, his tone light. Sophia greeted Victor with her usual enthusiasm, toddling over to him with her arms outstretched. He scooped her up effortlessly, a genuine smile spreading across his face as she giggled. Maria watched them, her chest tightening with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. "You're getting good at this," Maria remarked as Victor set Sophia down. Victor glanced at her, his smile softening. "I'm learning." As the afternoon wore on, the three of them found themselves in the small park near Maria's apartment. Sophia played on the swings, her laughter ringing out as Victor pushed her gently. Maria sat on a nearby bench, watching the scene with a strange sense of contentment. For a moment, it felt like they were a real family. "Do you ever think about what life will be like after the baby's born?" Victor asked suddenly, his gaze still on Sophia. Maria hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I try not to think too far ahead," she admitted. "It's easier that way." Victor nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about it a lot," he said quietly. "About what kind of father I want to be." Maria studied him, her heart softening at the vulnerability in his voice. "What kind of father do you want to be?" Victor was silent for a long moment, his hands resting on the swing's chains. "The opposite of mine," he said finally. Maria nodded, understanding more than she let on. "Then you've already taken the first step?" Victor glanced at her, something unspoken passing between them. "I hope so," he said. The weeks continued to pass, and Maria found herself relying on Victor more than she ever thought she would. He was there for doctor's appointments, late-night cravings, and even the occasional meltdown when Sophia's tantrums pushed Maria to her limits. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was trying, and that effort meant more to Maria than she could express. But not everyone in Victor's life was as accepting of their arrangement. One evening, Victor arrived at Maria's apartment looking uncharacteristically tense. His usually impeccable suit was slightly rumpled, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested he had been grinding his teeth. "What happened?" Maria asked, closing the door behind him. Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. "My family." Maria frowned, motioning for him to sit. "What about them?" "They've decided to involve themselves," Victor said bitterly. "They think I'm making a mistake, jeopardizing the Langston name by associating with you." Maria's stomach dropped, a wave of anger and hurt washing over her. "And what do you think?" Victor looked at her, his gaze steady. "I think they're wrong." Maria crossed her arms, her defenses rising. "Are you sure about that? Because it sounds like you're starting to have doubts." Victor stood abruptly, pacing the small living room. "I'm not doubting anything," he said, his voice firm. "I told them this is my decision, and I'm not going to let them dictate my life." Maria's heart softened slightly at his words, but the pain lingered. "You need to understand something, Victor," she said quietly. "I've spent my whole life fighting to prove I'm enough, for Sophia, for myself. I won't let anyone make me feel small, not even your family." Victor stopped pacing, turning to face her. "I don't care what they think," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "I care about you, Maria. About Sophia. About this baby. That's all that matters." Maria stared at him, her walls slowly crumbling. "Words are easy, Victor," she said. "It's the actions that count." Victor nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Then let me prove it." In the days that followed, Victor made good on his promise. He distanced himself from his family, refusing to let their disapproval influence his choices. It wasn't easy, Maria could see the toll it took on him, but he remained steadfast, a quiet determination driving him forward. Maria, too, found herself softening toward him in ways she hadn't expected. They weren't just coexisting anymore, they were building something together, something fragile and new but undeniably real. One evening, as they sat on the couch after Sophia had gone to bed, Victor turned to Maria with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You've changed my life, Maria," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "You and Sophia have given me something I never thought I'd have, a chance to be better." Maria's throat tightened, tears pricking at her eyes. "You've changed too," she admitted. "I didn't think you had it in you, but you've proved me wrong." Victor smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that sent warmth spreading through Maria's chest. "I've had a good teacher," he said. Maria laughed softly, shaking her head. "You still have a lot to learn." "Then teach me," Victor said, his voice earnest. "Because I want to get this right." Maria stared at him, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. "We'll figure it out," she said. "Together." Maria stared at the mirror in her small bathroom, her reflection almost unrecognizable to her. Her swollen belly, the exhaustion etched into her features, the faint but persistent ache in her back. Everything reminded her that her life had changed irrevocably. The thought was overwhelming, but it also carried a strange sense of hope. For all the uncertainty, there was a tiny part of her that believed things might turn out better than she ever dared to imagine. Victor had become a constant presence in her life. Though she had resisted at first, she now found herself relying on him in ways she never thought she would. He showed up unannounced with groceries or Sophia's favorite toys. He sat with her during long nights when her pregnancy aches kept her awake. And though he was far from perfect, he was trying, truly trying, to be there for her and the life they were bringing into the world. But Maria still couldn't shake the fear that it was too good to be true. She knew what it felt like to be abandoned, to be left holding the pieces of a shattered promise. And as much as Victor seemed to have changed, part of her couldn't help but wonder if he would stick around when things got truly hard. Victor arrived that afternoon with a small box in hand. Maria opened the door, raising an eyebrow at him. "More gifts?" she asked, her tone teasing but curious. Victor smiled, holding the box out to her. "This one's for you." Maria hesitated before taking the box, her fingers brushing against his briefly. She opened it carefully, revealing a simple but elegant necklace with a small pendant shaped like a tree. She stared at it, momentarily speechless. "It's a family tree," Victor said softly, his voice uncharacteristically tender. "I thought it might be fitting." Maria looked up at him, her chest tightening. "Victor, You don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I just wanted you to have it." Maria nodded, her throat too tight to respond. She clasped the necklace around her neck, the cool metal resting against her skin like a quiet promise. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as someone struggling to get by, but as someone who mattered. A few days later, Maria was woken by a sharp pain in her abdomen. She sat up quickly, her heart racing as another wave of discomfort hit her. Sophia was still asleep in her crib, and Elena had gone home for the evening. Maria gripped the edge of the bed, her breaths shallow as she tried to calm herself. Reaching for her phone, she hesitated for only a moment before dialing Victor's number. It was late, but he picked up after just a few rings. "Maria?" His voice was alert, concern evident. "I think something's wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "The baby?" "I'm on my way," Victor said immediately. "Hang tight." Within 20 minutes, Victor was at her door, his hair disheveled and his tie askew. He didn't ask questions, simply helped her into the car and drove to the hospital with a focus that reassured her even as fear clawed at her chest. The hospital room was cold and sterile, the hum of machines filling the air as the doctor examined her. Maria clutched Victor's hand tightly, her nails digging into his skin. He didn't flinch, his presence steady beside her. "It's a false alarm," the doctor said finally, his tone calm. "Just Braxton Hicks contractions. It's normal, especially this far along. But you should rest and avoid stress as much as possible." Maria let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through her. Victor squeezed her hand gently, his expression softening. "You're okay," he said, his voice low. "The baby's okay." Maria nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you for being here," she whispered. Victor smiled faintly. "Where else would I be?" The false alarm brought them closer in ways neither of them had expected. Victor began spending even more time at Maria's apartment, helping her with Sophia and taking care of the little things that made a big difference. Cleaning, cooking, running errands. Maria was reluctant at first, but she soon found herself leaning into his support. One evening, as they sat on the couch after putting Sophia to bed, Maria turned to Victor with a question that had been nagging at her. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "It's more than what we agreed to?" Victor leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Because I want to," he said simply. "Because you and Sophia, and this baby, matter to me." Maria studied him, her heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. "But why? You've spent your whole life chasing success and legacy. Why does this matter now? Victor hesitated, his expression clouded. Because I've realized that none of it means anything if I don't have someone to share it with, he admitted. I spent years thinking I could do it all on my own, but I was wrong. I don't want to be alone anymore, Maria. And I don't want you to be alone either. Maria's breath caught, her chest tightening with a mix of hope and fear. I don't know if I can trust that, she said softly. I've been let down before. Victor reached for her hand, his touch gentle. I'm not perfect, Maria. I've made mistakes, and I'll probably make more. But I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. Maria stared at him, her walls slowly crumbling. I want to believe that, she whispered. Then let me show you, Victor said. Let me prove it. The weeks passed in a blur of preparations and anticipation. Maria's due date was fast approaching, and with it came a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Victor was by her side every step of the way, his support unwavering. Even Sophia seemed to sense the changes, clinging to Maria and Victor with a newfound intensity. One evening, as they sat together in the nursery Victor had helped set up, Maria looked around the room, her heart swelling with emotion. The walls were painted a soft blue, and the crib was adorned with a handmade quilt that Victor had insisted on buying. This is more than I ever could have dreamed of, Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Victor smiled, his gaze warm. You deserve it. Maria reached for his hand, her heart full. We deserve it. When the day finally came, it was both chaotic and beautiful. Maria went into labor in the early hours of the morning, and Victor was at her side in minutes, guiding her to the hospital with a calm determination that belied his own nervousness. The hours stretched on, each contraction bringing a mixture of pain and anticipation. Maria gripped Victor's hand tightly, her nails digging into his skin as she fought through the waves of discomfort. He didn't complain, his presence steady and unwavering. You're doing amazing, he said softly, his voice filled with awe. Maria let out a shaky laugh, her eyes brimming with tears. You're just saying that? No, Victor said firmly, his gaze locking with hers. I mean it. You're incredible, Maria. His words gave her strength, and when the baby's cries finally filled the room, it felt like a miracle. The nurse placed the newborn in Maria's arms, and she stared down at the tiny life she had carried for so many months, her heart overflowing with love. Victor stood beside her, his eyes misty as he looked at the baby. He's perfect, he whispered. Maria smiled, her gaze never leaving her son. Victor reached out, his hand gently resting on the baby's head. Thank you, Maria, he said, his voice breaking. For everything. Maria looked up at him, her heart full. We did this together, she said softly. And we'll keep doing it together.